Thank you, Julie. Next up, we have Neil Bradshaw, and I want people to feel free to come and go through the chairs. Those of you who have been here for the last 15 minutes have noticed there's food and beverages outside. There are many other events going on around the library, so people will be coming and going. Please feel free to do that. Also, feel free to bring in food or drinks into the lecture hall. Or
might
ice.
Be a good time right now.
Don't leave during Neil's reading. But Neil Bradshaw was elected mayor of Ketchum in 2017. He's been a full-time resident of the Valley since 2005 and works as a business advisor and principal for Murphy Business and Financial of Southern Idaho. He is also the volunteer president of the Ketchum Community Development Corporation. Welcome, Neil.
Good afternoon. What a wonderful gathering here. So my book is called Our Towns. You may have heard about it. It's a 10,000-mile journey by a couple, James and Deborah Fallows. They flew around the country and they made observations about all the little towns, or many little towns, big towns, medium-sized towns around America. And I just found it kind of inspirational what they learned and what they took away. I'm just going to give you a couple of different readings. First is just to give you a flavor of what they were doing and flying around, and then maybe just a little bit of some of their conclusions, thoughts for their ideas of what made a healthy, happy town. And certainly I've learned a lot from reading this book. This is when they were flying up the coast towards Eastport, Maine. After a brief spell at home in Washington, we were flying up the coast towards Maine before it got really cold. During the flight, we were reminded of one of the truths about air travel that had motivated us in the first place. Flying across the landscape on a clear day at low altitude predictably reveals things that you had not known or noticed. From 1,500 feet up, about the height of the Empire State Building, you're far enough away from the ground to discern patterns, not visible at street level, but close enough to pick out details that to airline passengers would just be blurs. From 2,500 feet above the ground, nearly the height of the world's tallest building, you can see far enough in all directions to notice how cities interleave with suburbs, or how a course of a river, a ridge, or a tree line shapes the farmland or settlements around it. Often the speed and perspective of the aerial view makes economic and social gradients amazingly vivid. This was certainly the case on the leg of the journey as we flew at 2,500 feet along the full extent of the Maine coast, from the New Hampshire border north. An hour in, when we passed over Bar Harbor and Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island, it became clear that we were simultaneously crossing not just geographic, but gentrification line. Behind us to the south and west in Kennebunkport, in the thriving city of Portland, in Rockland and Camden, and well-known resort towns, houses with big porches had faced out towards the sea, the waters had been crowded with sailboats and other pleasure craft, and we would see families with children walking or taking bicycle rides. As the miles passed, Bar Harbor wore on, the houses got smaller and less summery. The sailboats gave way to commercial fishing rigs, and the major sign of human activity was the occasional pickup truck bouncing down a road. This was too far for most vacationers or second home shoppers to come. The population of Maine is poorer and whiter than America as a whole, and much older. The communities generally got poorer and older as you move north and east, a shift whose effect was quite visible even from above. We were headed that day to the easternmost point in the state, and for that matter, the entire country. This was the tiny town of Eastport, population 1,400, which sits across a mile-wide strait from Campobello Island, which is on the Bay of Fundy in the Canadian province of New Brunswick. And then they go on to describe their experience there. I'm going to kind of jump around and just talk about some of their experiences and some of the observations that I thought were particularly interesting. In Burlington, we found 7 Days being a print newspaper that is influential in local and statewide politics and has been a business success, defying a trend of most publications across the country. Its print circulation was 3 times higher when we visited it than it had been in the paper's inception as an alternative weekly in the mid-1990s. It employed more people than ever before, and it was on pace to have much higher total revenue than its previous high before the crash of 2008. What made their paper different? I asked Paula Routley, its publisher, co-founder, and co-editor. People look at our paper, and it makes them happy and interested to be here, she said. It was a vehicle of local consciousness and involvement. That motivates them to do something and participate, which makes it more a community and gives us something to cover. It's a cycle that works. Thought it was an interesting comment about the effect and the contribution of a local paper to our community. The other comment she made about Burlington is people like living here. They define success as finding a way to stay. I just skip now to, they said 10.5 signs of civic success. What were the broad conclusions from visiting all these different towns and their travels? Just going to outline 3 of them. The first, people work together on practical local possibilities rather than allowing bitter disagreements about national politics to keep them apart. We were traveling during the run-up to the bitter midterm elections of 2014, and then while the Supreme Court was ruling on same-sex marriage and Obamacare, and then as the 2016 presidential campaign, including the Trump insurgency, was gathering steam. People knew we were visiting from Washington, and some learned by asking that I once worked for a Democratic president. Given the places we were traveling, I imagined that many of the people we interviewed were Trump supporters. But it just didn't come up. Cable TV shows were often playing in the background, most frequently Fox News, and if people had stopped to talk about the TV fair, they might have disagreed with each other and with us. Yet overwhelmingly, the focus in successful towns was not on insoluble national divisions, but on practical problems the community could address. The more often national politics came into local discussions, the worse shape the town was likely to be in. Signs of civic success, number 5. They have downtowns. This seems obvious, but it's probably the quickest single marker of a condition of a town. For a young country like the United States, surprisingly many cities still have good bones via the classic Main Street style structures built from the late 1800s through World War II. In the mall and freeway decades after the war, some of these buildings were razed and many more were abandoned or disfigured with cheap aluminum fronts. Most of the cities were visited with pouring attention, most of the cities we visited were pouring attention, resources, and creativity into their downtowns. The Main Street America project from the Natural Trust for Historic Preservation has coordinated downtown revival projects in some 2,000 communities across the nation. Of the ones we saw, Greenvilles and Burlingtons are now the most advanced in this process, studied by planners from the rest of the world. San Bernardino's is still the furthest behind. Sioux Falls, Bend, Allentown, Fresno, Riverside, Holland, Rapid City, St. Mary's, and many others mark points along the continuum. But downtown ambitions of any sort are a positive sign, and occupied second and third floor apartments and condos over restaurants and stores suggest that the downtown has crossed a decisive threshold and will survive. Final. Point number 10, they have big plans. Successful cities have big plans. For the United States as a whole, the very idea of ambitious national greatness projects seems preposterous. There's no money. There are only efforts the government can undertake. The only efforts the government can undertake are military. It now counts as victory simply to keep funding for the national parks, or NASA, or NOAA for health and science research from being cut. For better or worse, it was a different America that built the country's interstate highways and went to the moon. Cities, because they can do things, still make plans. If I see a national politician with a blueprint for how things will be better 20 years from now, I think, good luck. In fact, few national politicians even pretend to have a long-term vision anymore. When a mayor or community council shows me a map of how the new downtown residences will look when they're completed, or where the new greenway will go, or the new bike path, I think, I'd like to come back. So that's a little synopsis of some of the things that were said. There's 10 and a half suggestions here. There's a whole bunch of examples of what to do, what not to do, what they've learned. Every town needs a bike path, they also say. We've got one of those. So it was a pretty interesting read for me, pretty exciting and certainly formulates some of my thinking in my amateur career as a politician. We have 2.5 minutes for some questions if you want, and then we'll move on. Thanks for your time.